Our goal as Bible teachers is to help people to know God, to know His Word, to live it out and base their lives on His principles so that they can reflect who He is in everything they do. And in Titus, we focus on teaching inductive methods so that people can discover who God is on their own. But then what do we do with those people that cannot read or write? There are over 1,268 languages around the world that still don't have any scripture translated. So what do we do with them? How do they know Jesus? How do they discover who God is? One of the missionaries, when they were serving in Amazon area, he said that they constantly met Brazilian people that said that they cannot become Christians because they don't know how to read and write. Is this what we want to see? No. It seems that sometimes we think that we can only know God if you know how to read, but that's not what we want to see in our lives. About 2/3 of the whole world population are oral learners. That means that it's people that cannot, will not, or will not just to learn new ideas through oral means. But oral communicators are in every culture, in every area. So if we are to fulfill the Great Commission, we need to reach those people, and we need to adapt our ways of teaching in order that they can understand better. So the question is, how do we communicate to those people? How do we share gospel with them in a way that they understand, in a way they not only hear it, but they can understand it? And we need to remember that it's our job as the ones that bring the message to make sure that we do it in a way that is understandable. And it's not their job to learn how to understand the gospel, but we need to present it in a way that they understand it. So in this lesson, we will talk about who oral communicators are and what can we do to teach them in a way that helps them to learn and remember information and to know gospel better. So 2/3 of the world population are oral communicators, and that means that it's people that do not use written word as a main source of information for them. But ironically, when most of the times when missionaries come to those cultures, they teach in a way that is very strategic, analytical, literate, and they often use books and printed materials, which doesn't always translates well into oral cultures. So we will focus today on how we can reach them better. And in order to do that, we need to know who oral communicators are and what do we mean when we say oral communicators. And of course, the first thing that comes to our mind is that it's a group of people that cannot read or write. But it's true, but it's also way more than that. Just because someone can know how to read, it doesn't mean that they will use reading as their main source of getting information or analyzing it and learning things. So there's two primal ways in which we receive and process information, and we can say that it's oral and literal. So oral is something that is very natural to every human being. We are all born and we learn through oral means. Oral cultures, oral learners are very attuned with everything that happens around them. We use the smells and sound and all the environment around us, and we learn through that. Orality emphasizes the interconnections of everything that happens between a person and an environment around them. So information, facts, ideas, and values are taught through stories and myth and symbols and proverbs and other people around them. So that's the first one. The second one is a literal means, and that's something that we learn as we go. As we grow up, we learn to be literal, and that's where we learn to process and analyze information from reading materials. We categorize them based on their function and what they do. So our reasoning and our reasoning is dependent on the information that we read. And in this way, our facts and ideas come from very logical and systematic processing and analyzing of information. And these are two very different ways of taking information, processing it, and learning it. And the thought process is very different in these two ways. Often we can think that maybe people that cannot read or write are not as smart as someone who can easily read, or that they are not as mature and things like that. But that's not true. The reality is that any illiterate person, the person that cannot read, they can learn any facts just as well as a literate person if they are taught in the right way. Oral person has a harder time to follow a very structured, linear-based presentation. But if they are taught in using oral means, they will remember any fact and any concept and understand any concept just as easy, just as fast as any literal person. Majority of our humanity functioned throughout history in orality. In fact, all the history that we have was passed on to us through the stories, the myth, the epic songs that takes years, days to recycle. So it's something that always existed and existed in every culture. And in fact, Christianity in the beginning was also passing on through oral tradition, because very small percentage of people could read at that time, and yet the stories of the Bible, the principles of the Bible were passed on through generation. And it's only not until the Reformation and the creation of the printing press when Christianity became more literate and focused on reading the Bible, studying it, and processing it that way. So in the beginning, it was more an oral culture. And we will naturally teach in a way that is more natural to us. And most of us are literate people. We learn how to read and we use it in everyday life. So we need to remember that when we present a message in a way that is natural and common to us, our oral learners in our audience will understand only about 20% of what we are saying. But if we adjust the way we speak, the way we present, will use some oral means of communication, they will understand 75 to 80% if we present it in a way that is more natural for them. So since they cannot read or write, it means that for them, they can only know what they remember, because they cannot take notes and refer to them later or look back. So they only know what they remember. For them, knowledge is something that can be recalled, which means that in our teaching, we need to make sure that what we say and how we say and material that we are presenting is memorable. We already mentioned that oral ways of communication are natural for humanity, and we learn to read and write later. Just think, as babies, we all are oral learners. We hear things, we repeat things, we say, we ask questions, and in that way, we grow our understanding. I have a nephew, he's 4 years old, and 2 years ago, they moved to Germany, and he learned to speak German. But he never learned an alphabet. He still cannot read, he still cannot write, and yet he can speak the language and understand and keep learning new things every day. So that means that, because it's very natural for us, so all of us can learn when we use an oral means, and it's actually easier for us, and we'll learn and grow in our literate understanding and processing. And because of our education, most of us became more literal or even highly literate people. And when we use literal means on an everyday basis, we kind of lose our oral capacities. It's harder for us to remember things. We need to write down. We rely on written information instead of our memories. And the more we function in our literate ways, we lose our oral capacities to do it, and the other way around. It's worth noting that there is no acceptable or agreed on definition of what literacy is. It depends on where you are, in which country are you from, and how they define literacy. But because there's if it's just a person that can read, but there's a big difference between somebody that can read or write their name to somebody that can read a newspaper. But there's also a difference between somebody who can read newspaper or can read like graduate level books, right? So it's a different on our literacy and what we do with that information. So we'll talk about the levels of literacy because we or grow in it or lose it in our lifetime. So there is typically 5 levels of literacy that we can look at or accept it. And first one is primarily illiterate people, and that will be 35 to 55% of the whole world population. That means that it's people that prefer oral communication to any other. And out of these people, almost half of it will be people that are primary oral learners, which means that they do not know how to read. They never seen a word. They don't have an idea or concept of what is written word. So all they know is oral communication. For them, words are just like written words, a part of the pictures. And these people will prefer to receive information through oral means, stories and experiences as they go. So then we have functional illiterate people, and that's people that begin to read and write. They maybe finish education to like grade 8, but never continue to develop it, and they don't use reading and books as a way to gain more information and understanding. So their preferred learning method still will be stories. Then we have semi-literate people, and that's people that continue to study after grade 10, that they still use reading and literature for their knowledge and receiving information and studying. But they still also function in oral means, and they can do both. Then we have functional literate people, and that's people that continue to read their literacy after they finish schools and graduate. They can learn concepts and ideas just from the written text, and they can analyze and process information that they are reading. So these people will be what we categorize as a literate person, somebody who can read information, process it, and understand what it means and learn from it. And then we have highly literate people, and that's just people that continue to study in universities, graduates, postgraduates, that they read every day and continue learning every day through literate means. So for our purposes for this lecture, by oral communicators will mean any person that prefers to learn new concepts and ideas by using oral means, by using stories and experiences instead of a written word. All right, so we just talked about who oral communicators are and the level of literacy that we have in the world, or how we growing from oral learner to literate learner throughout our lives. Now we can talk a little bit more of what are some of the characteristics of oral learner or oral cultures that we minister in. And usually oral cultures, they share similar characteristic and a worldview with each other. And if we want to serve them well, if we want to really reach them, we need to understand the differences between our cultures and their cultures, our understanding and their understanding, our way of processing information and theirs. Usually, new missionaries, when they come to a new culture, they think that it's just enough to translate their sermon or their teaching to a different language, and that will make it oral, because they have the language that they understand, they say in it, and that's enough. But that's not enough. In reality, to have a good communication, we also need to have a greater understanding of a culture and of the language that is used and the meaning that they bring into words and understanding that they have. Because language is something that is used to pass on the worldview, that used to debate and understand their beliefs. So we really need to also pay attention to the language itself and how it's used, and a culture around them, and and how they understand God and what concepts of it they have. So a good, effective teacher or missionary, they would know that they need to learn both language to communicate, but also a culture around them to be a good servant. And as we come on a short-term trips, we want to make sure that we also have an idea of a worldview of a culture that we are serving in, so that we can reach them better. And because oral learners share in some of the characteristics, we will talk about them as in generalized ways. So one of the characteristics of oral cultures is that they are very relational. Everything they do is based on relationship and around relationship. A relationship is basically more important than anything. And if you need to find out something, some information, you go to somebody that you know, that you trust, and you ask them. And that's how you learn things. That's how you discover things. And usually it's an elders or leaders in the community. Oral learners are very group-oriented. They are event-oriented, not time-oriented. And that means that life happens around community. Life happens in community. Everybody is involved in life, and things are done together. And their life is structured based on events, not a schedule or a time, which means that often going to a school or to an appointment will be after something. It will be not according to the watch at 3 o'clock or 12 p.m. It's going to be after this TV program on a TV, or after the lunch, or after the service. So it's all events. It's more about relationship and being with people and being present in a moment than being scheduled and doing things by time. So they are event-oriented and not time-oriented. They are very present-oriented, which means that they are highly aware of what's happening around them. And as I mentioned before, they are learning from their experience from outside. So what they see, what they know to be true, that's what they will understand and will learn from that. So very present in right now moment, which also makes them very spontaneous. They like a variety of things and to do different things in the same time. They love to have few conversations at the same time, and they will be able to follow all of those conversations at once. They often will, or they can interrupt, and interruption is seen as a way of adding information, not being rude. They just add to your information, and that's just how it works. And they like to be involved in a few ways in the same time and focus on lots of ideas at once. In order for them to remember, there happens a lot of repetition of the things over and over again. And they do that in order to remember, and in order that information go from their short-term memory to the long-term memory. So it's something that as they repeat, they can recall it later. And it helps them, it brings them to understanding as they hear it again and again. Usually it's a very emotional people. They are in tune with their emotion and have no problem with expressing it in front of people, which actually they are very bodily people. So the way you stand, the facial expressions are very important to them, and it's all part of communication, and it's all part of you given the information. So they're very physical and use their bodies as they talk, and which also means that when you talk to them, they will give you a lot of feedback using their body and their facial expressions as well. Most of oral cultures are animistic, which means that they have basis of animism in their major religions, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, or anything else, which means they believe that there is personal or impersonal powerful beings that control life of a human, and we need to figure out what it is so that we can manipulate them. And that's important to know when we go and try to teach them about who God is and some ideas that we have about God. And so that as we teach them, as they hear your stories, as they hear your teaching, they start to believe the true things about God and change their concept and their ideas of spirituality into truth. So we will be better communicators and more effective at communicating with oral cultures if we know their worldview, their beliefs. And the best way to do it is by learning their folk stories. If we learn their myth, we will have a better understanding of the belief system that they have. And from that, we can build our teachings to be more relevant to them. So knowing their stories of origin, their stories will show you their values, and then you can build your teachings using that information, and that will make it more relevant to them, but also more understandable to anyone who hears you. There is a phrase, and they say that every human culture in the world seems to create stories as a way of making sense of the world. So if we know their stories, it will help us to stay relevant and be understandable to people that we are trying to reach. And now that we know some of the characteristics of these oral learners, we can talk about how do we reach them? What are some of the methods that we can use in order to have our communication more effective and present our teachings in a way that not just heard, but really understood? I recently read a story from one of the pastors in India. Well, let's call him Rajesh. And there was a story about his ministry and experience in ministry. And here is what he says. I'm going to read you his report of the ministry. He says, I was saved from a Hindu family in 1995 through a cross-culture missionary. I had a big desire to learn the Word of God, and I shared it with the missionary. So the missionary sent me to a Bible college in 1996. I finished 2 years of theological study and came back to my village in 1998. I started sharing the good news the way I was taught in a Bible college. To my surprise, people were not able to understand my message. A few people accepted the Lord after much labor. I continued to preach the gospel, but there was very little fruit. I was discouraged and confused, and I did not know what to do. But then his story makes a turn. And he says that in 1999, I attended a seminar where I learned to communicate the gospel using different oral methods. I understood the problem in my communication as that I was mostly using the lecture style method with printed books that I learned in my Bible college. So after the seminar, I went back to the village, but this time I changed the way I communicated. I started using storytelling as the method, and I did it in my native language. I used gospel song and traditional music of my people. And this time people in the village really began to understand the gospel in a way much better. And as a result of it, people began to come in large numbers. Many accepted Christ and took baptism. There were one church with few baptized members in 1999 when I started my ministry. But after I attended this seminar, now it's 2007. In 7 years, we have 95 churches with 1,600 baptized members and 100 more on the way that are ready to be baptized. I think this story really illustrates how much more effective we can be when we use the right way to communicate with people, when we use oral means to communicate with oral cultures. And when we use things like that they know and that are understandable to them, when we use their language, when we use their songs and their stories, it makes it easier for them to accept the gospel and understand it. So if we use oral means of communicating, we can reach more people with our teachings, and that's what we want. In our literate society, we rely on the written word so much. We start our day by checking our emails, reading news. Maybe throughout the day, we check online to see what's happening in the world. We might read, I don't know, nutrition information on a package of the food that we buy. We might read the sign on the road and make a right turn. We might fill in some bank information or insurance information form. So we use written word, we use literal means all day without noticing it. And because of that, it seems that it's natural and everybody does it. But as we see, not everybody uses it. So for oral culture person, for oral learner, there is no such thing as a written word. For them, words are just sounds, and once you said it, it passed, and it's just a past experience. And that means that what we say, words are very important, and they need to be memorable in order to remember. Because remember, the oral learner can only recall what they know and what they remember. Because they can't look anything up. For us, if we forget a Bible name or a recipe or, I don't know, capital of some country, we know where we can look information, right? We can go online, we can search this book or that book, but for oral learners, they cannot look things up. They can only recall and know, like they can only remember things. So we need to make sure that when we teach it in a way that is memorable for them. And if you had to completely rely on your memory, right, you probably will make sure that you do some songs and acts and dances and some action in order to help you remember things and an order of things. And that's exactly what oral learners do, and that's exactly how we can teach oral learners in a way that they recall and retain information better. So first thing that we can use, it's rhythm and songs and chanting and music in general. Do you ever have those moments when a song from like a commercial or some tune just gets stuck in your head and you walk around and you constantly hear that in your mind? Probably. And that's because songs and music are very powerful and it's easy. We all remember many words of the songs that we know. And because songs are, when the words put on tune and rhythm, it's easier to remember. So as you teach, you can use that. You can create a song or ask your audience to create a song that will help you to help them remember what you're saying. So you can put the main ideas in a song or a rhythm or some kind of chant or repetitive phrase that they can use over and over, and they will be able to remember it. For example, if you teach creation story, you can ask people to repeat that God created and it was good. So they can all say it was good, and you can sing it through. And with that repetition, you involve them with their voices to participate in your teaching. And that's what we want. For oral learners, for maximum learning, we want to have as much involvement, as much process, and together with them as we can. So when we ask them to repeat something, or we give them these little phrases that they can remember or songs that they can sing, they will remember it better. But it can be words, but it also can be actions or emotions or something that they do as you teach or from material that you teach. Usually, very often in oral cultures, there are some kind of movements that go together with a song or a story. And we can do the same in our teachings. When we teach some concepts or something, we can add some movements to it that makes it easier for people to remember. As you know, when we teach Bible overview for all our steps of God's plan of redemption, every step we have a movement that people can do in order to remember the chronology and remember the story better, right? We have the creation, we have the fall, we have the promise of redemption, we have Abraham. And as we teach those things, they might sound silly to us or seem silly to us, but they really help us to remember. And every time you hear word creation, you do this because that helps you to remember. And if it helps us to remember, it also helps oral learners to remember. And we want to give them things that can help them to remember and recall information. So if they don't have our Bible overview booklet, they will have motions that they know, and they can go through it in their minds and remember what each steps mean. Because oral learners cannot look up information, or they don't take notes to look back, we need to make sure that what we say is memorable. We can give them some like phrases that are punchlines that they can know. And they usually remember information by connecting it to people or events that happens. And we can use that. And as we present, we should connect our information to the real things that happen in life, or real people and real events. For example, if we try to teach them the structure of book of Genesis, again, because it's a great book to teach, if we try to teach them a structure, it can be harder to say like, oh, these chapters are about this and these chapters are about this. But we can tell them that book of Genesis has 4 main events in the beginning and 4 main people after that. And that will help them to remember the structure. And as they think of what the book of Genesis is, they can think, oh, what were the 4 main events, and who were the 4 main people in the book? And that is something that we can give them to help them recall the structure of book of Genesis. And they're just small things that we can use to make things memorable for people. They might not remember chapters 11 and 12 to 50, but they will know that there's 4 events and 4 people. So let's give them things, help them to remember, and create things that they can remember better. In oral cultures, because the stories and songs and everything was and different narratives were passed on through generation, they created these typical phrases and patterns that they use in their stories. And we might call them like it's a very cliche phrases or cliche situation that they use in the stories, but because they are familiar with people, it helps people to remember stories and concepts better. So usually situationally, we have where the stories happen, and it would be in the battle or at the dinner table. There would be a hero, there would be a helper over here. So it's a typical people and situation that they will use. They will also use a very typical ways of describing things. For example, if it's a soldier, it's not just a soldier, but it's a brave soldier. There's emotion to it. If it's a princess, it's a beautiful princess. If it's an oak, it's a sturdy oak. And it doesn't mean that there is no not brave soldiers, or there's not beautiful princesses. But because we want to use the pattern that exists that helps them to remember, in our stories, the princesses always will be beautiful and the soldiers always will be brave. And that will help people to remember. So it's these stereotypical phrases and patterns that we can use as we tell our stories and as we teach them. They also use these epic characters or heroes that do extraordinary things. And in the Bible, there's also all these heroes that do extraordinary things. We can think of Solomon and his strengths, or 300 warriors of Gideon. Right? Those are all people that did something extraordinary, and it's shocking and surprising, and that helps people to remember. So we can use those as we teach the stories of the Bible. We can connect them to real people that did things and that model God's principle through the stories. And we can teach people through that. We can also use dramas and dancing in our teachings. Again, might not be natural for us, but oral cultures love their dances. They love act things out. They like dramas. So as much as you can, involve your audience, and you can act out a story for yourself as you present, or you can ask your audience to create a drama or create a dance that will help them to remember. And the good thing about these dramas and dances is that when you leave, they will continue to use them. They will continue to share those stories by using those dramas and dances. And there's story after story how that works. So really, as we think of teaching oral communicators, we need to remember that we need to often we'll have to step out of our comfort zone, of our natural ways of teaching in a way that will reach our audiences. And that means that we sing and we dance and we do dramas, even if we don't like it, even if we think that who needs it. But remember that our goal is not to just present our material. Our goal is to really reach people's hearts and see them transform and see them understanding what we are saying. And for that, we adapt the way we teach, not expect them to learn the way we teach. So we use songs and dances and rhythm and dramas and tell them stories in a way that help them to understand it. So we can use art and posters and pictures to also communicate and illustrate something that we are teaching. I have a friend in Amsterdam, and they used to do these tours where they would teach a Bible overview in museums. They would use these pieces of art and go through story of the Bible using those big pictures that people come to see from all over the world to see. So, and it was their way to, and they would relate it to the Bible story and show how God created the Word and how Jesus came and all of that. So we can use pictures that are familiar to our audiences, right? So if a person never seen an airplane and they don't know what airplanes do, maybe using that picture will not be very helpful, as cool as you think it might be. So when we use pictures and stories, or use some objects to illustrate or explain something, we need to make sure that we use things that are familiar and known to our audiences. Which brings me to a next point, is using the object lesson. It's something, an object that you can bring, that you can refer to throughout your teachings, and you can compare something in your teaching to that object or something like that. I remember one time in one of our speakers, she brought this huge laundry basket with her in class, and it was full of white and black clothes. And as she was talking about how we are to sanctify our lives, how we are to get rid of sin in our life, she would one by one pick out the black pieces of clothes from that basket and illustrating that this is how we take the sin and things that should not be in our lives from our lives, and that we should be sanctified. And that lecture was 15 years ago, and I still remember it because she took time and brought that basket with her in a class. So object lessons really work, and they make it memorable for people, and that's what we want. They might not remember exactly and every word that you're saying, but they will remember if you use it well, if you explain and if you connect it well. So now 15 years later, I still remember that we need to sanctify our lives and take away all these things from our life because of the well-used object lesson. So you can use anything. You can use the flowers. Again, it needs to be something that is in their life in their environment. If they don't have it in their culture, if they don't understand, if person never seen snow, maybe don't use snow as an example, because it will be a concept that they don't grasp, right? So it needs to be something that they've seen, that they experienced, that they've touched, they smelled, something that they know, or they know somebody that knew about it and told them about this, right? So it needs to be something that they trust. We can use proverbs, and it's great to use proverbs from their culture as well. We can refer to it, or we can use proverbs from the Bible. We have a whole book of them, and we can use that as a wisdom to gain knowledge and understanding. And proverbs are very familiar in oral culture, so when we share proverbs from the Bible, they will be, because it's a short and easy to remember, they will be able to easily understand and remember them. We basically, when we teach oral communicators, what we want to do is include them in our teachings, right? And that's why we use the repetition and songs and dances, because when we involve them, they will remember it better. They will understand things better. So in whatever you do, think of the ways how you can involve them, right? So it can be, again, dramas or things like that, but it also could be discussions. You can break your audience into groups, give them a question and they can discuss it. Again, that will be involving them in the learning process, and the more involvement they have, the more learning will happen. Because they are group oriented, actually discussions work great. If you can give them an assignment and ask them to work on it together, it also will be very helpful and will help them to understand. Instead of giving them assignment that they can do by themselves, reading or something, just give them something to work in together as a group. Many oral cultures are taught through modeling. They have an elder or parents, somebody that show them how things done, and a person would observe them and then repeat it together with them and do it after them. And that's also what we want to have in our teachings. Instead of just giving them assignment, it works better if we explain the assignment, but also do it together with them, where we walk step by step with them. Instead of just giving them this theoretical question, we actually help them to go through it with them, or we model the kind of answers that we expect from them, so that they know exactly what we want to do. And again, remember, we want to do it in a group because it's a group-oriented culture. They learn together from everything that happened in a class. Because they are event-oriented people, they will be more, the way they remember information is more related to people and things that happen than dates and exact dates. So, for example, if for literate person, knowing the date of Exodus or exile will be very important, and it's something that most people do. For oral learners, they will know the event of Exodus or event of exile. They will know the main leaders that led people through it, but they might not know the date, and they also will not be concerned with knowing the dates. They focus on events and people. So we should be trying to teach them what happens instead of trying to push the specific date that will not help them to remember or understand information. So it's way better to help them understand what happened during Exodus than making sure that they know the date of Exodus. It's good to know the chronology, right? And they do retain information better if it's presented in chronological order. So we use chronology so that they know what happened and the bigger picture and bigger understanding of who God is. But it doesn't mean that we teach them specific dates. Of course, if it's necessary, we can do that. But as an oral learner, they're not very concerned about specific dates of things. When we talk about, again, teaching oral learners, we say that we use things known to them. And that's because for us, when we learn things, we add to what we already know. So it's much easier to remember and build on something that is familiar to them. And that's why I say that when we try to pick an object or illustration, that it needs to be something that is related to their specific culture, their specific place where they at, right? So we try to contextualize it as much as possible to make it relevant for our audiences. One big thing with teaching oral learners, we need to remember that they are very concrete thinkers. They don't think in abstract ideas, which when we present the gospel, we often talk about sin and redemption and righteousness, and there are great things, but those are concepts that is harder to understand for an oral learner. So when we present the gospel to them, we need to dress those concepts in stories that they can see something that they experience or somebody that they knew to understand those things. For example, we can say that honesty is the best policy. And most of us will know exactly what we mean. But for an oral learner is not very clear, because honesty and policy are very abstract ideas. Instead, an oral learner would prefer to say that it's an honest man that always succeeds or always prospers. And then it makes it more concrete, because they might not know honesty and policy. They cannot know it, but they probably know somebody that is an honest man. So they will be able to relate to that. And they probably know somebody that always prospers. Again, it's something, the concept that they can relate to. It's more concrete phrase. So instead of saying that honest men always prosper, they would say that, no, that honesty, instead of saying honesty is the best policy, they will say that honest man always prospers, because it's something that they can envision and imagine in their minds. It's something that they've seen, something that they know, something that they've experienced, and then it will help them to know what we mean. So as we teach, we should try to avoid those abstract ideas and put them in a way that are more specific and concrete and easier to understand. Which also means that because they are concrete thinkers, it's harder for oral learners to think rhetorically or theoretically. Imagine something that is not there, that they haven't seen, like just come up with things, right? Because they are present in the moment. They're focusing on what is here, what's in front of them, and what they can experience. So as we teach, we need to bring down our message to that level, to that understanding, and make it as concrete as we can. And even in our Christian ideas that can be very abstract, we have stories in the Bible that tell us those ideas. We see how people react in the Bible, and we can learn from that. We can see, again, stories of honest men and what does that do in person's life. So we can still teach all the Christian concepts that we believe in, but not, and do it in a way that they can relate and experience better, and they can understand and grasp it. So for oral learners, words are not things and object as much as an experience. So when we're trying to understand or explain something to them, we should try to do it through experience that they can relate to, or something that they can envision and know, and that will help them to understand it and relate to it. Also, it means that when we teach application, for oral learners, it will be harder to analyze themselves and they have difficulty describing themselves and analyzing of who they are, what they do, and where they are at in life. So sometimes when you ask some kind of questions, you will receive more concrete answer than you expect. For example, there was research done, and when oral learners were asked to describe themselves, they would say that, oh, I was born in this year, and I was born here, and I don't know, I used to be poor, now I'm happily married and I have work. So they describe themselves in a way, in the things that happen in their life that are very concrete. And if the conversation was continued and they would ask like, well, there's some people that are brave and understandable and honest, who do you think you are? The answer still will be more concrete, and they would say like, oh, we do the right things because we value what people say about us. If we do wrong things, people will talk about us. So again, you will see more concrete answers that they say. And that's okay. And as we teach, as we want to help people to learn to analyze themselves and give them an ideas of what kind of answers we are looking for. And when they answer more concrete than we expected, to see their answers behind it. And to help us, we would need to phrase our questions in a way that will help them to see the answers that we are looking for, so they will help them to understand what we mean and where we're going with our information, with our lecture, and with our questions. So be patient when you teach people to think in a different way, right? Because it's not wrong, it's not slow. It's just a different way of thinking and understanding. And it's our job as teachers to make sure that we form our questions and our expectations in the right way, so that helps people to participate in our lecture and participate in learning. And the best way to teach an oral learner, or really anybody, is a story, because stories are fun. Everybody loves stories. Every culture has stories, and people really, it's easy to follow stories, so people enjoy listening to a story, and then they can learn something from it, some concept or truth. So you can teach any idea through the story. Again, oral learners, because they are concrete thinkers, when we talk about honest man that is always prosper, they probably will tell you a story of honest man and how that affected his life, instead of just telling you that honest man always prospers. So they would put it in a story, they would put it in a more specific situation, and we want to do the same. Stories can be used, any stories. It can be your personal stories from your life. It could be your testimonies. Oral cultures love listening to your testimonies and what God has done in your life. So every opportunity you have, share that. And that will illustrate to them that God is active and at work in your life. And that will help them to trust you more in what you are saying. You can use stories of other people that you've heard. You can, of course, use stories from the Bible, because the Bible is full of stories. Most of the Bible is narrative, so we can use them to teach people the truth. And we can build the whole teachings just basing on a Bible story and characters and what happened, or people from the stories. And for oral learners, it will be easy to remember and recall it, because a story is easier to remember than some abstract ideas. And as I mentioned before, that when we tell the stories, it works best if we tell the stories or teach stories in a chronological order, so that they know events that happen, they know how story develops, and they see a bigger picture of who God is. But of course, we can also teach an individual story from the Bible if it's when it's appropriate to our context. But when we teach individual story of the Bible, we need to make sure that we give people context of what is happening in the story, what happens around the story. And before we teach that story, we need to ask ourselves a question: what do my audience need to know in order to understand this story? So we try to give them as little context as necessary, but as much context as necessary in order for them to understand what happens in that story. So that as you have a story, there is a setting to it, and they know what happens before that or what happens after that. And as you share the story, the goal of our story is not to share, just to tell a story for fun, but our goal is to teach them something from that story. So we want to also process that, and you can do that by asking some questions and let your audience to discuss those questions and do it in a group. One of the ways you can, I don't know, break them in pairs and ask them to first teach the story to themselves. So after you read the story or you told the story, you can ask your audience to repeat this story to each other so that they remember it better. And when they repeated the story, when they learned this story, you can ask them questions. And usually with those questions, you, again, need to step back first and think, what are you trying to teach them? What do you want people to see and remember from this story? And have good questions that will lead them to your goal. So you pick a story, you decide what you're trying to teach from that story, and then you create 2, 3, 4 questions that will help people to see those things, that will lead them to the goal and to idea that you're trying to teach them through that story. In the notes to this teaching, you will find a list of Bible stories that you can use in chronological order that help to see a bigger picture of the Bible and the whole story all together. And also for every teaching, for every story, there will be some examples of questions that you can ask, and you can use them as a resource, or just, you can look at it as an idea or use those stories in your teachings. But you can also create your own questions that will help you to reach your goal of that specific teaching that you're trying to teach. So today we learned that most of the world population are oral learners. It means that it's people that cannot or choose not to use literal means of reading as their main way of receiving information. And that we need to understand their world and their worldview in order to know how we can adapt our teachings in a way that they will not just hear it, but also understand it. And I think the main idea that we try to communicate here today is that we need to adapt our thinking as Westerners, as people that use literacy every day, in order to imagine how oral learners perceive our teachings and what it means to them and how they understand it. And for that, we need to adapt the way we teach. And for that, we need to use oral means to communicate it. We need to use the dances and songs and rhythm and involve our audience in learning as much as you can, because the more involvement we have with our audience, the more learning will happen. The more they can understand, the more they will retain. And that's exactly what we want. We want them not to just listen to our teachings. We want them to actually understand what we are trying to change and have their life change and their understanding of who God is change because of what they hear and what they're learning. So as teachers, it's our responsibility to step out of our comfort zone and teach in a way that will reach 100% of our audience, that can reach any person in our audience. And in that way, we'll see kingdom spread and gospel spread throughout the world. And all those languages and all those people that cannot read or write, they will still be able to know who God is and know the good news. And His will and His kingdom will be done on earth. So in closure of this lecture, I would like to leave you with these 3 questions. I want you to break into groups of 3 and answer these questions. First one will be, what are some new or surprising ideas that you learned from this lecture today? Second is, which of the oral communication means or methods do you think will be the hardest for you to do and why? And the third one is, what is one thing that you can do or include in your teachings to help oral communicators learn? So 3 questions. First, new or surprising idea that you heard today. Second, what do you think will be the hardest of those oral methods for you to do in your teachings? And the third one is, what is one thing you can include in your teachings that you can involve your oral communicators? So you can discuss it in your groups of 3, and that would be the end of the class today.